Well, we're continuing today with our series from the Book of Ecclesiastes. Started it last Sunday, and it's going to last for 10 weeks this summer. Ecclesiastes is not a book that is preached on all that often. I think there's a lot of pastors that really wouldn't touch this with a 10-foot pole. Lots of difficult and challenging themes to deal with in the book of Ecclesiastes. As a matter of fact, I saw a pastor friend of mine in the community this week, and in the course of the conversation, he said, "What are you preaching on now?" And I said, "Ecclesiastes." And he got the most pained look on his face, and he said, "And you can get the gospel out of that?" And I said, "Yep, I can get the gospel out of it." We're going to have a good time as we study Ecclesiastes. So that's what we're going to do, and I want to say, though, the other side of it is that I got several emails and comments from people here who said, "I'm glad you're taking on Ecclesiastes." Few people said it's always attracted me or intrigued me. A couple of people said, "Hey, that's one of my favorite books in the whole Bible. I never really understood it, but I like it." And so I'm glad that we're going to do this together. So I want to get us started with a couple of important things to keep in mind. I mentioned this last week. The book of Ecclesiastes is, first of all, pessimistic, okay? Life is no bundle of roses in this book. And another one is that this book is cynical, all right? A lot of real basic questions about life are asked. And the question is raised, is life even a good thing? Is life even a good gift? Is it worth living? And then third, this book is joyless. Life is a lot of hard work, a lot of toil, a lot of trouble, and in the end, things just don't seem to ever work out very well. Something very important to keep in mind as we work through the book is what is meant by this phrase, "under the sun." It has nothing to do with life in the desert, but it's a way of talking about life in the world without God in it, without reference to God. For people who don't know God, this is what life looks like. If all we had to go on is what we see around us, the teacher is going to explain what we see. So whenever it says under the sun, it means in this world only, apart from God. And most of this book is written from that perspective. Now, I think we ought to be truthful enough to admit that there are a lot of things we'll connect with in this book. And the fact is, we will not always disagree with the teacher's observations about life. Some of them we'll agree with. It's his conclusions that we will challenge from the perspective of the gospel. But we ought to be honest about the fact that, in the history of the church, there's a rich tradition of doubt. There are times when we all struggle with those deep questions. Is God really there? Does He really care about me? Why does God seem silent in the midst of what I'm going through? Ecclesiastes is a book that speaks into those deep mysteries and questions and doubts that we struggle with. We can identify with much of what is said here. The author refers to himself as the teacher. Some of the older translations go with the preacher. This is a very hard Hebrew word to translate into English. And I suggested that we should read Ecclesiastes much like we read the book of Job. Now, you remember that Job's friends had all kinds of advice for him, didn't they? And most of it was not good advice. Some of what they said was partially true. And we'll encounter some things in this book that are true as observations about life, and especially if you leave God out of the picture. This is what life looks like. But we have to take what we read with a grain of salt. The teacher spends a lot of time speaking, I'm going to say it this way, as in character. Taking on the persona of one who does not know or walk with God. Let's look at what the teacher says here today. First, the teacher claims that God has set us up for a meaningless existence. Basically what it says in the passage that was read this morning by Noah, the end of chapter 1, verses 12 through 18. We notice a couple of things. I mentioned last week, even though tradition assigns this book to Solomon, most Bible scholars, even conservative Bible scholars, do not believe Solomon himself actually wrote it. For starters, the name Solomon is never mentioned in the text, and Solomon put his name on everything else he wrote. For another, verse 12 says, speaking of the author, I was the king of Israel. Now, it doesn't make sense that Solomon would say that. You see, there was never a time he could have written this book and say, I used to be the king of Israel. I was the king of Israel. He was the king of Israel until he died. And then in verse 16, it says, I had greater wisdom and knowledge than any kings in Jerusalem before me. Well, if you think about it, that's only one king. Solomon's father, David, Saul, did not rule from Jerusalem. It was still in Jebusite hands. Who conquered Jerusalem and put the capital there? David. It's one of his great conquests. But there's no doubt the teacher is writing in the persona of Solomon. He's speaking as if he were Solomon. I suggested last week he was a student of Solomon's philosophy and felt compelled to write this book, bringing Solomon's wisdom perspective to life. Just like in our time, sometimes a book will be published under the name of one author, but then we discover it was written by a ghostwriter. Solomon in the ancient world was known for his wisdom. And wisdom in that time meant you could figure out life's deepest mysteries. And because of that, you could give good advice to others and you could find happiness in your own life. He's definitely speaking from the perspective of Solomon. The teacher says he's used wisdom to examine the meaning of life. And looking at life through the lens of wisdom, here is what he discovered. He blames God for the problem of life's meaninglessness. The teacher claims, and this is one of those cynical thoughts, God has done a number on us. He's put us in a world of meaninglessness, and there's nothing we can do to break out of it. The end of verse 13 and verse 14 says, I soon discovered that God has dealt a tragic existence to the human race. I observed everything going on under the sun, and really it is all meaningless, like chasing the wind. What's he saying? Saying that life is this terrible treadmill that none of us can get off. We're all stuck on it. And chasing the wind is his image. Anybody here ever chased the wind and caught it? Raise your hand. And if any hands go up now, I know it's because you're not really paying attention to the sermon. Right? You can't catch the wind. You can't chase the wind. By definition, that's an absurdity, and that's his point. Life is all wrapped up in hopeless absurdities. And he doubles down on the problem. He says in verse 15, and what's more, what is wrong cannot be made right. What is missing cannot be recovered. In other words, there's nothing any of us can do to fix this problem. We're stuck with it. And he says at the end of this chapter that using wisdom to examine the problem only increased his pain and his sorrow. The more he knew about life, the worse he felt. Now, in fairness to the teacher, the Apostle Paul also spoke about the futility of life in this world without Christ. And yes, this is the gospel. Paul said in Romans 8:22, against its will, all creation was subjected to God's curse. And he goes on to say that we as human beings are caught in that curse, and Christ alone is the one who delivers us out of it. And he says the whole world is waiting. He says the creation is groaning, waiting in eager expectation for the liberation that we will experience from the effects of the curse, sin and evil. that the revealing of Christ as Lord of the universe is going to bring. The teacher is trying to narrate how oppressive life is if you have no hope, because you don't know God. Our only hope for meaning in life is found in God. Folks, whether we realize it or not, whether you name it this way, whether you talk about it, all of us are on a quest to find meaning in life. Did you know that? We all need meaning. It's an innate yearning that God built into us. It's one of the important things that separates us from the animal world. As human beings, we're trying to do a lot more than just survive from day to day. God gave us the ability to think rationally and analytically. We want to reflect. We want to consider. We want to know, what's the meaning of life? What's the purpose of all of this? Why am I here? Central to the human struggle. We want to discover life's true meaning. We want to know if there is really a purpose. Next, the teacher calls attention to some of Solomon's futile attempts to overcome meaninglessness. The teacher, speaking in the voice of Solomon, has made several futile attempts to overcome meaninglessness. And when I read this, it reminded me of that 1980 country western song recorded by Johnny Lee, part of the Urban Cowboy movie, Looking for Love in All the Wrong Places. No, I'm not going to sing it this morning. Except this is looking for meaning in all the wrong places. He says he tried pleasure seeking, and that didn't work. He says he tried living a life of laughter and partying, and that didn't work. He says he tried drinking and carousing, and that didn't work. He says he tried living foolishly, and that didn't work. Now there's a shocker. None of that worked. None of that gave him meaning. That's verses 1 through 3 of chapter 2, and then in verses 4 through 8, he goes into more detail. That's kind of the way he writes. He likes to give these sort of general overviews and then come back and go down into the details. He says he tried to find meaning by building a material empire. Listen to this. Huge homes, beautiful vineyards, gardens, parks, fruit trees, giant reservoirs for irrigation, slaves to do all the work, large herds and flocks. He says he had more material wealth than anybody in all of Jerusalem. He had monetary wealth too, and he found no meaning in it. Folks, Solomon's great wealth was well documented. Sometime when you have a few minutes, just take a look at 2 Chronicles 9, 13 through 29. I'm just going to read a couple of sentences here. Every year, King Solomon received over 25 tons of gold in addition to the taxes paid by the traders and merchants. The kings of Arabia and the governors of the Israelite districts also brought him silver and gold. The king also had a large throne made. Part of it was covered with ivory, and the rest of it was covered with pure gold. 6 steps led up to the throne, and there was a footstool attached to it covered with gold. All of King Solomon's drinking cups were made of gold, and all the utensils in the hall of the forest of Lebanon, that was one certain hall, were of pure gold. He had a fleet of ocean-going ships sailing with King Hiram's fleet. Every 3 years, his fleet would return, bringing gold, silver, ivory, apes, and monkeys. King Solomon was richer and wiser than any other king in the whole world. They all consulted with him to hear his wisdom. Each of them brought Solomon gifts, articles of silver and gold, robes, weapons, spices, horses, and mules. King Solomon also had 4,000 stalls for his chariots and horses, and had 12,000 cavalry horses. Some of them he kept in Jerusalem, the rest he stationed in various other cities. It just goes on like that. And yet, in his soul, he wasn't satisfied. He wasn't content. He didn't have any sense that, oh, now that I've got all this stuff, life is beautiful, life is wonderful, life is great. Inside of him there was an emptiness and a yearning. And the reason is because material and monetary wealth, folks, are deceptive. They seem like things worth living for. And lots of people choose to build their lives around material wealth only to be deeply disappointed. You can write this down. When they achieve their dreams and it's still not enough. There's still a churning. There's still a yearning. There's still an emptiness within that says there's got to be more to life than this. And folks, I want to tell you, there are a great many wealthy people today who feel exactly that way. Next, he calls attention to the pleasure-seeking life centered in wine, women, and song. In verse 9, he says, I denied myself no pleasure. We've got a name for that. What's it called? Hedonism. That's hedonism, isn't it? Just living for the next thrill. Solomon was the Hugh Hefner of the ancient world. It says he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. A concubine was basically a royal prostitute. This was just a private harem for the king. But guess what? He couldn't find meaning in unlimited, unrestricted sex. And you know something? Nobody ever has. And many people have tried, and they're still trying. By the way, ask Tiger Woods how this one worked out for him, okay? He lost his marriage. His career as a golfer has never been the same. We have a new name for it now. We call it a sexual addiction. And folks, it is an affliction. It is a form of sin's oppression, and it is evil's grip in a person's life. And a lot of people are still trying to find meaning this way, but it's not how God created us. He did not make us for promiscuous sex. Pleasure as a life focus has never delivered lasting meaning for anybody. Next, he compared the difference between living wisely, by which he means just making good, wise, responsible decisions, thinking about the future, being a solid citizen, paying attention to what you do and how you live. And it didn't work. But he contrasts it with living foolishly, which he says he tried. Living only for the moment, wasting time and money, thinking only of himself, not caring very much about how his life impacted anybody around him. Now, of course, between the two, given the choice, we would say, well, wisdom has the upper hand every time. It's better. And he quotes a proverb to that effect. Verses 13 and 14. I thought wisdom is better than foolishness, just as light is better than darkness. For the wise can see where they're going, but fools walk in the dark. Oh, but there's still a weakness with wisdom. Wisdom doesn't deliver because the wise face the same fate as the foolish. They die. Remember I told you there's a pall of death that hangs over this book. Death ends everything. Death silences everything. And what he's saying is after you've been dead and gone for a while, nobody remembers you or what you accomplished. You're just a gravestone in a forgotten cemetery. So where did all your wisdom get you? This is cheery stuff, isn't it? Ever take time to walk around a cemetery and look at the grave markers there? It's something we ought to all do. It's actually a good thing to do, particularly if you're, wrestling with what is the meaning of life. I often do it when I have a funeral or when we visit my father's grave in Oregon or my wife's father's grave, my father-in-law in Spokane. And it's just interesting to look at these grave markers that represent people's lives. But here's what I'll tell you. After 30 or 40 years, nobody decorates your grave. Nobody left to decorate your grave. Maybe your relatives have moved and live somewhere else. You see flowers on the graves of those who have died recently, maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago, where they still have, relatives, friends who remember them. But those that are 40, 50, 60 years old, you go there on Memorial Day, you don't see any flowers. The only thing you see is whatever the cemetery decides to put there. His point is, death ends everything. There can be the wisest person in the world in a grave right here, somebody who had a PhD, somebody who wrote books, somebody who made all kinds of contribution to knowledge, and right next to him can be married a fool. Somebody who was in and out of trouble with the law, somebody who never accomplished anything with their life, and there they are, right next to each other, and nobody knows the difference. That's what he's saying. Next, he tried workaholism, trying to find some meaning, pouring himself into his work, thinking, surely whatever I build with my own hands will give me meaning and satisfaction. I'll be able to look at it and say, there, that's what I built, that's what I did, that's what my life accomplished. I built that. And maybe there will be a marquee, or maybe you can leave your name on the company. Maybe there would have been something that said Solomon's Department Store that would have continued on, or Solomon's Auto Repair, or Air Solomon, or something. And in verses 22 and 23, he describes the life of a workaholic. He says, what do people get in this life for their hard work and anxiety? By the way, if you've ever been in business or had a job that requires 70 or 80 hours of work, maybe you can identify with this. He says their days are filled with pain and grief. I read that and I thought, he must have tried being a pastor. And then he says, even at night, they cannot rest. In other words, they lay awake at night worrying about their work. Will their business make it? Will the bank shut them down? Will their competitors drive them out? Will their boss fire them? Will they get downsized out the door? The teacher says the whole quest of throwing yourself into your work is meaningless. Because no matter what you accomplish in your work, it will be handed on to someone else. You don't live forever, not in this form and in this life. And that person, they may take what you've worked so hard to build and run it right into the ground. And that happens, doesn't it? People build businesses and then they hand them on to their children or sell them outright, and pretty soon they go down the tubes. I was thinking about a few examples of this, and I didn't really work hard to think of examples, but for those of you that have been around Kent for a while, as I have, whatever happened to Gorm's? Remember Gorm's? Raise your hand if you were ever at Gorm's. Great hamburgers, right? Where is it now? I think it's a Papa Murphy's or something like that. Did you know that Gorm's was started by the same guy that started the Dick's Drive-Ins in Seattle, the hamburgers? It was a great hamburger, and I used to go there once in a while. Every time I went there, Pastor Dan was there. He beat me to it. We liked that place. It's gone, out of business. Let me give you another one. Where is G.I. Joe's? Remember G.I. Joe's? Yeah, G.I. Joe's, that great thriving business. They got a new CEO, and 4 or 5 years later, they were bankrupt. It happens. So where's the meaning in putting all of your energy and all of your life into your work and saying, this was mine, I made it what it is? But what I do want you to notice is the mood changes now for what comes next. He will talk about where meaning is discovered. In verses 24 through 26, there's a huge shift in the teacher's attitude. He comes to the end of his rope with trying to find meaning in life. He's given up because nothing works, nothing produces it. And oddly enough, when he quit searching and just accepted the simple gifts of day-to-day life, when he got back to the basics, what happened? He had a moment of realization. He found some meaning. He discovered there is a God, or he told us that he believes in God. And he says you can count on him. And if you take life day to day from his hand, you'll find meaning. This is one of those moments where he breaks character and he says, actually, I did find some meaning in life. I found it in God. Listen, he says, So I decided there is nothing better than to enjoy food and drink and to find satisfaction in work. Then I realized that these pleasures are from the hand of God. Notice the change in his attitude. For all of us, having the right attitude about life is the key to finding meaning. The Apostle Paul taught us that much. Here's what he said in 1 Timothy 4:4. Listen to this. Since everything God created is good, we should not reject any of it, but receive it with thanks. Whatever God gives you, receive it with thanks. Instead of plunging in and indulging in all kinds of experiments to try and find life's meaning, God is very willing to show it to us if we will just accept day-to-day life from his hand, on his terms, and take with a grateful heart whatever he gives us. The food and drink mentioned here is not the gluttony and the wine bibbing mentioned earlier. Here it is what Jesus had in mind when he taught us to pray. Give us this day our daily bread. It's the plate of food when you're hungry, the cup of cold water that refreshes the soul. And the work is the job you show up to enjoy doing because it's something God has given you to do and God has gifted you to do. And you dedicate it to his glory. Verse 25 says, "For who can eat or enjoy anything apart from God?" That's the key to finding meaning. The teacher is telling us in this brief moment that God is real. You can't really do life under the sun apart from God because God is real. Knowing God is the key to meaning in life. If you don't know him, you won't find meaning. Not ultimate meaning. If you do know him, you will find it every place you turn. And verse 26 says, God gives wisdom and knowledge and meaning to those who please him. But there's also a warning here. He says, if you go the other way, if a sinner, that would be someone who doesn't know or care about God, becomes wealthy, God will take that away and give it to someone else who pleases him. The reality is, that's meaningless. Because when that happens, everything the wealthy person worked for and took pride in is gone. It's only in God that we find meaning. Let's pray together. God, it really is true. We're all on a quest to find meaning in life. We don't all daydream about it. We don't all talk about it. But it shows up at key moments and in key decisions that we make. We want there to be meaning in life, but we cannot find it apart from you. The teacher is right when he says there is no meaning under the sun, if he means by that simply in this world apart from God. But there is meaning in this universe that belongs to you because you created it, you created us, and you created us for the eternal purpose of fellowship, relationship with you. It's in that relationship that we find our meaning. Thank you for not leaving us adrift as orphans, as those lost, but of showing yourself to us and, most powerfully of all, sending us Jesus to bring us home to you. In his name we pray. Amen.